Welcome back to Lecture 6, Brain Part 2. We're going to start talking about regions of the brain now that we've had a general introduction to organization of the brain and talk about the brainstem and the cerebellum. So, oops, I forgot to outline cerebellum, but you can see where we are in the general lecture outline. All right, so the brainstem has three different parts. The most superior one is the midbrain, so you can see that in green on the diagram here. Let's see. All right. So there we go. There's the midbrain up there, and it's a relay station for tracks. What does that mean? Well, we have axons coming into the brain, axons coming down from the brain, and then they're going to pass off the signal to another neuron, which is then going to send a signal up or down. So kind of like a relay race, passing the baton. We've got one neuron sending its axon in and giving a signal to another neuron, which is then going to relay or pass that signal on to a neuron either up in the brain or down in the spinal cord. We also find some visual and auditory reflexes here. So when somebody comes at you really quickly and you turn and look, or if you hear a loud noise, you have a thing where you turn and look. Those reflexes are actually housed in the midbrain. The midbrain also contributes in a variety of ways to body movements. We'll see a lot of parts of the brain do because things are coming through, right? It's a relay station. Now remember, the midbrain came from the mesencephalon. That was that kind of middle part of the three vesicle stage of the neural tube. So it's kind of its own unique thing because that's the only mature part of the brain that came from the mesencephalon, but it kind of slums with the other guys and is termed as part of the brainstem. Moving inferiorly, now the next structure we see is the pons, and the pons is just anterior to the cerebellum. So here's the cerebellum back here, and so it acts mostly as a relay station between the cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. And because of that, it's really important for coordination of our muscle movements because the cerebellum is important for those. So the pons is mostly a relay station. Its word comes from the Latin. It means bridge, right? So it's kind of this connection between the cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. And then, of course, just based on its location, lots of things are going to be moving up and down through the pons on their way to get to other places. Then third and finally, the most inferior structure we have is the medulla oblongata. This is your basic life support system. So it has the control centers for breathing, super duper important. Blood pressure regulation, also super duper important. Swallowing, kind of important. Coughing, vomiting, sneezing, you might not think those are important, but they actually are really protective mechanisms. And so it is the medulla oblongata that basically keeps us alive, along with some help from the midbrain and the pons. And it is what sends the signals to the diaphragm to contract. So you may or may not remember that the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, which means it doesn't contract on its own. It needs a signal from the nervous system in order to contract. So it is the medulla oblongata that is doing that. And thankfully, it is doing it subconsciously, right? It's not in our upper prosencephalon parts of our brain. It's in our primitive rhombencephalon part of the brain. It's just doing its thing without me even having to think about it, which is awesome. Now, of course, I can think about it. I can use higher centers of my brain to intentionally, yes, take a deep breath and those types of things. But at baseline, medulla oblongata is doing that for you. So for basic life support, you really just need the brainstem. And you absolutely have to have the brainstem. So you cannot be a living human being or mammal of any sort without, excuse me, my medulla oblongata. Okay, you cannot survive without a brainstem. So one example of folks who can live without much of a brain except for a brainstem is a birth defect called anencephaly. So this is a situation where, due to a number of different potential causes, the Zika virus being one of them, interestingly, if a pregnant person is infected with Zika virus at a certain point in their pregnancy, this can occur. And they often don't develop anything other than the brainstem, although you can see in this illustration here, we also see a diencephalon. Now, what's interesting is if you don't have the cerebellum, if you don't have those upper proper brain structures, you don't have any consciousness, you don't have any intentional movement, you only have reflexes. So oftentimes these infants are stillborn, but sometimes they survive for a few hours or days, or in some rare cases, they can survive months to years. This is a photograph of Vittoria de Cristo, who was one of the longest lived anencephalic infants, and she lived to be about 2 years old. So you can see there that the skull didn't fully develop, because the skull normally develops in concert with the brain. So the skull is not going to get big as if there's a brain if there is no brain. So you get a differently shaped head. This, just so you can kind of see how you might diagnose this, this happens to be an MRI of a fetus in utero. So it's actually upside down, because babies are usually upside down. So I turned it right so that you can see the baby. All right, so let me show you what we're seeing here. This is a normal infant. And look, here is the brain. Here is the eyeball. Yes, you can see here's an arm. Here's the spine. These are things in the intestines. Here's part of the leg. So that is a normal MRI of a fetus in utero. This is the placenta, if you're interested. And this is an anencephalic infant. So what we see here is here's the spine, and we see here's the nose and the mouth, and then there just really isn't much of a head at all. So this is a really severe one. This probably wouldn't even make it all the way to term. So that is anencephaly, and depending on how much of the brain is present, they can live sometimes for a brief amount of time. So that's the brainstem. On to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, located on kind of the back of the brain here, it's kind of its own little thing. Its functions are for coordination and balance. So it's amazing. It takes a lot of brain to keep us from falling over all the time. The other interesting thing about the cerebellum is it has these things called arbor vitae. So if we look at the pattern of white matter, so in this upper one, right, we look at the pattern of white matter inside the cerebellum, it kind of looks like a tree, and so they very poetically named it arbor vitae, which in Latin means tree of life. I'm also going to take advantage of our opportunity here to remind ourselves of the fourth ventricle, which is just anterior to the cerebellum. Here is the pons and the medulla oblongata. And then, of course, this here is the cerebral aqueduct, which is bringing CSF that's coming from the third ventricle. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Okay, so that's the cerebellum. One of the functions that the cerebellum is involved in is proprioception. So I just wanted to kind of introduce this concept to you. Proprioception is your ability to sense where your body parts are, both relative to your other body parts, right? So my arm is up over my head, my arm is below my head, as well as to where you are in the world. So if I turn sideways, right, my arm is over my head, but it's sideways in the world versus now it's up and down in the world. So your ability to kind of know where you are in relative to your other body parts and in relationship to kind of the world and gravity and all those types of things, that is called proprioception. And as you can imagine, gymnasts need to have an incredibly well-developed sense of proprioception, right? They need to know where all their body parts are at any given moment and how it relates to the environment around them, or they are going to miss that beam. Okay. So in summary, brainstem has 3 parts. Midbrain does a lot of relay tracks, but also has visual and auditory reflexes and contributes to body movements. The pons is the main relay station between the cerebellum and everything else. So it's really important with coordination of body movements. Medulla oblongata, my favorite part of the brain, because it keeps me breathing. It also regulates blood pressure, swallowing, and other life support functions. Overall, you cannot live without a brainstem. You need to have it. As long as you have at least a brainstem, there's a possibility that you could live. But in anencephaly, if you're missing a lot of the other parts of the brain, then often they do not survive for very long. And then the cerebellum is, of course, important for coordination and balance. And we introduced that new vocabulary term of that sense of proprioception, where your body is in relationship to your other body parts and in relationship to the world around you. So that's 6B. And next we'll start talking about the diencephalon and the cerebrum.